If white wants to explore other options, the English is one of the most trusted, solid alternatives. We reach the strategically complex opening by starting the game with c4. Turning the game into the English opening, white controls the d5 square, and typically prepares a light-squared strategy with knight c3, g3, and bishop g2, increasing control over the central d5 and e4 squares. The English should not be viewed as a simple sideline. It's a rich opening with a wealth of strategic, as well as dynamic ideas to explore. Let's take a look at some of the basic ideas, starting with black's most principled response, e5. Occupying the center, creating a mirror image of the razor-sharp Sicilian defense if white opens the game with e4, and black replies with c5. In this way, white can be said to be playing a Sicilian defense up a tempo. Although this may suggest the play will become quite sharp, which is possible, white can also use this extra tempo to steer the game toward more positional waters typical of the English opening. Increasing control over the central light squares with knight c3 is a popular option, and white may also prepare to develop the light-squared bishop with g3, preparing to meet the natural knight f6, with bishop g2. White's light-squared bishop is an important piece in the English, supporting both the center, as well as adding pressure against black's queenside. We reach a critical moment in the English. Black must decide how to handle the central struggle based upon the d-pawn. Striking in the center with d5 creates a reversed open Sicilian type of position, which we'll later examine. The d-pawn may also be used to support the center by playing a future d6. One typical plan is to develop the other knight with knight c6. White's strategy to control the central light squares continues with knight c3, joining the c4 pawn and light-squared bishop and adding a third defender of the d5 square. Black's dark-squared bishop has two important squares to consider. Bishop b4 adds pressure against white's knight on c3, when white has to decide whether to allow bishop takes c3, gaining the bishop pair, but accepting a slightly compromised pawn structure in the process. In this case, white may continue with knight f3, simply continuing to develop while fighting for central control. On the other hand, the knight may leap into the center with knight d5, confronting black's dark-squared bishop. In this case, black may respond with bishop c5, increasing pressure against white's kingside, leading to a complex positional struggle. Bishop b4 is a popular choice to examine, and black may also consider the straightforward bishop c5, adding pressure against white's kingside while preparing kingside castling. White's knight on g1 has two important paths to consider in order to enter the game. Playing e3, followed by knight g to e2 is an interesting idea we'll later examine, preparing to strike in the center with d4. The most direct path is to play knight f3, adding pressure against the e5 pawn while preparing to castle. Black should not be too eager to lunge the pawn forward with e4, as this is well met by knight g5, attacking the e4 pawn, and revealing the light-squared bishop as a third attacker against this overly zealous pawn. Black is unable to maintain this premature claim of central space. Instead of advancing the e-pawn, black can build a solid pawn chain with d6, supporting the e5 pawn while liberating the light-squared bishop. A common continuation is for both sides to castle. When white defines the typical pawn structure with d3, the pawn chains serve as a compass to help orient the direction of play. White's pawn chain from e2 to c4 points toward the queenside. Coupled with white's light-squared bishop pointing in that direction, white will typically plan to expand on that side of the board with a3 and b4. Black's pawn chain from c7 to e5 points toward the kingside, so coupled with black's bishops pointing in that direction, this may prove to be a desirable area of the board to play. Of course, this is only a useful guideline and should not serve as an absolute direction of play. Grandmaster Michael Adams played the typical a6, supporting the b5 square while extending the dark square diagonal for black's bishop, creating an important escape square on a7 if necessary. His opponent, Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen, continued with the typical English strategy of queenside expansion with a3. Anticipating b4, black decided to tuck his bishop away on a7. It's important for white not to forget that this bishop still exerts important influence against the kingside. White expanded on the queenside with b4, when black centralized his bishop with bishop e6. Contemplating the d5 pawn break would prove unwise if white is able to respond with knight g5, attacking the bishop while revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure against the d5 pawn. On the other hand, black may have no immediate intention of playing d5, and may be prepared to play queen d7, centralizing the queen, also creating a queen-bishop battery pointing toward white's kingside. Bishop b2 is one sensible choice, and Grandmaster Carlsen decided to play knight d2, revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure down the long diagonal. Now that white's knight is no longer able to meet d5 with knight g5, d5 is an interesting pawn break to explore. White was not afraid of this option, as c takes d5 opens up the c-file, which may later be utilized by a rook. And it also prepares the possible option of knight c4, adding pressure against black's central e5 pawn. It's also possible to prepare the d5 pawn break with knight e7, with c6 and d5 to follow. Playing knight e7 immediately would hang the b7 pawn, so Grandmaster Adams supported it with rook b8. The rook is pleased to vacate the long diagonal, avoiding the dangerous glare of the light-squared bishop. The game continued with rook b1, supporting a possible b5 pawn break, when black continued with knight e7. Now that the knight is no longer under attack by white's light-squared bishop, preventing white from comfortably advancing on the queenside with b5 is suddenly in the air. So white prevented this while grabbing more space on the queenside with a4. c6 is one reasonable choice, when white will likely increase the queenside tension with b5. Grandmaster Adams decided to focus on development with Queen d7. We reach a critical moment in the game. Many English players understandably prefer to keep their strong light-squared bishop on the board, exerting important pressure down the long diagonal. That being said, it's important to not become overly attached to this piece, because if white plays rook e1, preparing to meet bishop h3, attempting to trade bishops with bishop h1, white can actually land into trouble quickly after knight g4. White is suddenly reminded that black's dark-squared bishop is alive and well on a7, threatening the f2 pawn. If white tries to block this diagonal with e3, then black's kingside initiative comes to life after f5, threatening to blast open the f-file with f4 when white is under serious pressure. In this case, preserving the light-squared bishop is definitely not worth the problems on the king side. Grandmaster Carlsen was not afraid to allow black to spend time in order to exchange light-squared bishops, so he continued with b5, invading black's territory while also clearing the path for white's dark-squared bishop to enter the game. We see these ideas in action after bishop h3. In bishop a3, white enjoys a space advantage on the queen side, although black's idea to exchange light-squared bishops takes some of the sting out of this pressure. Black's position is quite solid, as the central stronghold on e5 remains secure. Knight f3 is a popular, straightforward way for the kingside knight to enter the game. A more subtle approach is to first play a3, which certainly seems like a strange way to help develop the knight on g1. The idea is to play e3, followed by knight g to e2. In order to better understand why a3 is an interesting option to explore, let's first take a look at the more direct approach e3. This is a nearly universal setup white can employ in most variations of the English, preparing knight g to e2, and in many circumstances d4. Playing e3 does weaken the d3 square, allowing the tactical shot d5. This appears to simply blunder a pawn, but the point is that c takes d5 is well met by knight b4, threatening knight d3 check. One reasonable response for white is to play d3, preventing the unpleasant check on d3, but it does allow knight b takes d5 with a roughly level game. White may also try to complicate matters by playing d4, provoking the central exchange e takes d4, e takes d4. It's important that black does not play bishop takes d4, hoping that white will capture the bishop, allowing the deadly fork knight c2 check, winning the queen. Bishop takes d4 may set up a trap, but it's actually black who falls into the trap after queen a4 check, attacking the king and unprotected knight, winning a piece. A stronger response is to play bishop e7. White should not be overly focused on trying to protect the extra d5 pawn, as moves like bishop f5 are in the air, preparing unpleasant threats such as knight c2 and knight d3 check. White may continue with knight g to e2, allowing black to regain the pawn. This is a perfectly playable option as long as white is comfortable playing with an isolated queen's pawn. There's plenty of play in the position, but some players prefer to avoid opening the game and clarifying the structure so quickly. Playing the immediate e3 is certainly worth exploring, although black appears to gain a good game after d5. An interesting way to prepare this move is by first playing a3. This helps prepare e3, as black cannot rely upon d5, followed by knight b4. a3 is also a useful move to prepare queenside expansion with b4. It's possible to discourage this plan with a5, but this does weaken the b5 square, and white may still be able to achieve an eventual b4 with proper preparation. A more flexible choice is to play in the style of Grandmaster Michael Adams with a6, creating the familiar escape square on a7 if necessary. His opponent, Grandmaster Viktor Lasniczka, continued with e3. When after black castled, we see the kingside knight enter the action from the e2 square. The knight is a bit less active than it was on f3, but in this case the light-squared bishop enjoys greater freedom on the long diagonal. Grandmaster Adams continued with the typical d6, supporting the center while liberating the light-squared bishop. White has a variety of options to explore, including b4 and castling kingside, but white decided to play the prophylactic h3, discouraging bishop g4 as white prepares the central pawn break d4. In some cases, white may even consider g4 and knight g3, eyeing the enemy f5 and h5 squares, but continuing to weaken the kingside is not a decision to take lightly. Grandmaster Adams continued with bishop a7, but let's first understand why black wouldn't activate the light-squared bishop with bishop e6. This appears to be a strong move, activating the bishop while attacking the c4 pawn. But now the light-squared bishop and knight on c6 are suddenly in forking distance of a pawn. Instead of defending c4 directly, white has the strong tactical shot, d4, attacking the dark-squared bishop, so after e takes d4, the dark-squared bishop cannot both retreat to safety as well as prevent the deadly fork d5. So after bishop a7, white simply wins a piece with d5, forking the bishop and knight, an instructive tactical resource to keep in mind. The dark-squared bishop is vulnerable to both d4 and b4, so black spends a tempo to secure this piece with bishop a7. White is preparing to strike in the center with d4, possibly opening the center, so this is a good signal for white to castle. Now that the bishop is on a7, no longer vulnerable to a d4 shot, attacking the c4 pawn with bishop e6 is possible, when white may respond with b3 or knight d5. Interesting options worth considering. In the game, Grandmaster Adams decided to centralize his rook with rook e8, when white completed his plan of central expansion with d4. In the game, black decided to play h6 before playing e takes d4. It was also possible to play e takes d4 immediately. When after e takes d4, Opening up a path for the dark-squared bishop, black can secure the g5 square with h6, eliminating any possible bishop g5 ideas, while also creating a potential escape square for the light-squared bishop after bishop f5, opening up the h7 square if necessary. White is in no rush to play d5, gaining a tempo against the knight but also revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure down the diagonal. This also opens up the e5 square for black's knight, attacking the c4 pawn. In these sorts of positions, it's often a good idea to play king h2, helping secure the h3 pawn, as well as avoiding the unpleasant alignment with black's dark-squared bishop, which can be a source of tactical oversights later in the game. White is prepared to expand on the queen side with b4 and decide whether the bishop is best placed on b2, e3, or f4. Black may consider knight e7, clearing the path for c6, and if allowed, d5, fighting for central space. The position remains roughly balanced, but this is a typical English position in which all of the pieces remain on the board, with only a single pawn exchange so far, leading to a rich middle game struggle. So far, we've examined black's solid approach of reinforcing the center with an eventual d6, typically after the dark-squared bishop has entered the action so as not to interfere with its scope. A more ambitious approach is to use this pawn to strike in the center with d5. This can be prepared by first playing c6, when white can play the provocative knight f3, attacking black's center and trying to lure the center pawn forward, leading to double-edged play. Or white may decide to strike in the center immediately with d4, another important variation worth examining. A more direct as well as popular way to provoke a central crisis is to strike in the center immediately with d5, turning the game into the reversed open Sicilian, an e4 opening with colors reversed, mimicking how white handles the Sicilian, except being down a tempo. White should put an immediate end to black's central pawn duo with c takes d5, knight takes d5. In exchange for opening the d-file for black, white enjoys a semi-open c-file. Black enjoys more space in the center, and behind it the potential for more active piece play, but white will try to prove the time advantage, as well as piece pressure will have its say after bishop g2, threatening the knight on d5. Retreating the knight to b6 is black's most common choice, but in order to better understand why this is the case, let's take a look at the natural response bishop e6. Developing a piece while supporting the knight, white continues with knight f3, attacking the e5 pawn, so black defends the center with knight c6. After white castles, white is ready to strike in the center with a thematic pawn break d4. So any normal move such as bishop e7 is well met by d4, striking in the center and preparing to meet e takes d4, with knight takes d4. White's centralized knight attacks the knight on c6, as well as light-squared bishop on e6. This move also clears a path for the light-squared bishop, exerting serious pressure on the long diagonal. Black's position is already uncomfortable, so this is a position black should avoid. Since d4 is a positional threat, what happens if black tries to discourage this pawn break with bishop c5? This actually fails to prevent white from striking in the center thanks to the center knight fork trick, knight takes e5, destroying black's pawn center, activating the light-squared bishop, and luring the enemy knight into the center with knight takes e5, when white is once again able to strike in the center with d4, forking the bishop and knight with an excellent game for white.